The room smelled of pine boards and something older than pine, something that had no right to smell the way it did, rich and gold and faintly sharp, the way a thing smells when it has been tended the way good things deserve to be tended. Two men stood in the doorway of the stone outbuilding on the eastern edge of a Montana dairy ranch, and they did not speak. They were well-dressed men, the kind who wore their Helena money in the cut of their coats and the shine of their boots, and they had driven 4 hours from the city expecting to find ruin. They had driven 4 hours rehearsing the particular expression a man wears when he has come to confirm what he already knew. They were not wearing that expression now. On the pine shelves lining both walls, 14 wheels of aged cheese rested in their cloth wrappings, sealed at the rind with a pale crust of herb and salt. The light came through the single western window the way Montana light always does in late afternoon, unhurried, golden, indifferent to human drama, and it caught the surface of each wheel as if it had been arranged to do exactly that, as if the room had been waiting for precisely this light, as if someone had known. The men looked at the shelves, then they looked at each other, then they looked at the woman standing quietly to one side of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her expression giving them nothing at all. This is where the story ends. But endings, in Montana, are rarely where the meaning lives. To understand what this room holds, not just the cheese, not just the money those wheels would fetch when the contract was signed 3 days later, but the weight of what had changed here, the way a proud and lonely man had come to stand, a little differently in his own doorway, you must go back. Not far, only 3 weeks. 3 weeks was all it took. 3 weeks, and a woman with a brass-lidded tin no larger than a man's fist, and a $2 offer for a job that any person with options would have declined. She had arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of morning that cannot decide whether it belongs to summer or winter and settles sourly for neither. The road from town was dry and gray with dust, and she had walked it because she had no other way to walk it, and she was not the kind of woman who waited for another way when the one in front of her was passable. She had heard about the job from the woman who ran the boarding house on Caldwell Street, who had heard it from the feed store, who had heard it from a ranch hand who no longer worked at the ranch and seemed faintly amused telling the story. $2, the man was offering, to clean the cheese room. The cheese room. She had said she would take it. He had not always been a man who locked doors. There was a time, and the town remembered it, even if he had stopped believing they did, when the ranch had been something worth pointing to. When the pastures ran to the tree line and the milk came in clean and cold, and the buyers from Helena had tipped their hats at the gate and called him by his first name. That was before the bad summer. Before the well that ran shallow and the heat that sat on the valley for 6 weeks without mercy, and the milk that turned before it could be hauled to town. Before he had tried, in what he now understood to have been a desperate and poorly educated act of optimism, to save what couldn't be sold by making it into something else entirely. The cheese room had been his idea, every inch of it. He had read about aging rooms in a pamphlet from an agricultural society in Ohio. A pamphlet, as though a pamphlet could teach a man what generations of hands knew without reading a word. He had converted the stone outbuilding himself, laid the pine boards on the shelving racks, bought the salt, bought the cloth wrapping, watched the wheels of pale pressed curd for 3 weeks, and believed he was watching something transform into value. He had not been watching transformation. He had been watching rot learn patience. When the buyers came from Helena, 2 well-dressed men with clean boots who had no intention of being kind, they had stood in the doorway of the cheese room for exactly as long as good manners required, and then one of them had covered his nose with a folded handkerchief, and the other had turned away toward the yard with an expression that required no translation. They had rejected the milk. They had declined to discuss the cheese. They had driven back down the gray road without looking back, and he had stood in the doorway of that outbuilding for a long time after, not moving, because a man who mistakes silence for strength does not always know what else to do when there is nothing left to be strong about. He had locked the door after that. He had not opened it since. The ranch hands left, one by one, quietly, the way men do when they can see the arithmetic and the arithmetic doesn't favor staying. He did not blame them. He told himself he did not need them. He told himself a great many things in those months, standing at his kitchen window in the gray early light, watching the pastures that still looked, from a distance, like they belonged to a man who had not made a ruin of everything. He was 40 days from the bank's patience running out. He was a proud man. He was also, underneath the pride, frightened in a way he had no language for, the way a man is frightened when he has built his entire sense of himself on one piece of ground, and the ground is slipping. He put a notice at the feed store, $2, to clean the cheese room. He did not expect anyone to answer it. She had learned, by then, to read a notice the way other women read weather, not for what it said, but for what it was trying not to say. $2. Clean an outbuilding. Dairy ranch, 3 miles east on the Bitterroot Road. Inquire before 7 in the morning. She read it twice, standing in the doorway of the feed store with the cold still on her coat. A man did not offer $2 to clean a room that simply needed sweeping. $2 was an apology. $2 was the price of something a man could not bring himself to look at directly. She had known enough men, and enough hard seasons to understand that. She took the notice down from the board, folded it once, and put it in her coat pocket. She had been in town 8 months, surviving the way women survive when pride is the only luxury they cannot afford to surrender entirely. Mending, mostly. Some washing. A week here and there of kitchen work at the boarding house when the regular cook's back went out. She was not desperate in the way that breaks a person. She was desperate in the quieter, more dignified way, the kind where you count your coins at night and the counting takes less time each week, and you do not tell anyone, and you keep your coat brushed and your chin level, because the moment a town decides you are done, it becomes very difficult to prove otherwise. She owned very little. A wool blanket, a change of dress, a good pair of working boots that had belonged to her husband and had been resold twice, and a small brass-lidded tin, no larger than her palm, which she kept in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her body, the way another woman might keep a locket or a letter. The tin held salt, not ordinary salt, but a mixture her grandmother had made, blended with dried herbs according to a method that had no written instructions, because her grandmother had not trusted paper with the things that truly mattered. She had trusted hands. She had trusted the nose and the eye and the long patience of someone who understood that good things require tending and time and the willingness to wait without certainty. She arrived at the ranch before first light had fully settled. The rancher met her at the gate, tall, tight-shouldered, a man carrying something heavy he had decided to call ordinary. He said very little. He pointed to the stone outbuilding at the edge of the yard and said the door was unlocked and that she was to leave the room empty when she was done. She nodded. She asked no questions. He went back to the house. She pushed open the door of the cheese room and stood in the threshold for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust and her nose do the real reading. The smell reached her first, then the light, thin and gray through a single high window. Then the shelves, pine boards, warped with damp, holding nothing but the memory of failure. She stood very still. This was not a cleaning job. She had known that from the notice, but now she knew it in her hands, and in the tin she could feel pressing against her ribs. This was a beginning, if anyone had the knowledge to begin it. He found her standing in the threshold of the cheese room, still as a woman reading something written on the air. He had not expected her to linger. He had assumed she would take one look at the mess, pull a rag from wherever poor women kept their rags, and begin the mechanical work of erasure. Instead she stood, and he had to clear his throat to remind her he was there. He stepped past her into the room without ceremony, the way a man steps into a room he has decided to stop caring about. He swept one hand toward the shelves. Pine boards darkened with moisture, rinds gone wrong and scraped away, linen cloths left in piles because there had been no reason to fold them properly. And he delivered his explanation the way he delivered most things lately: clipped, factual, and emptied of whatever feeling had once lived inside it. The room had been an attempt, he said, a serious one, or so he'd believed at the time. He'd read what he could find. He'd built the shelves himself. He'd set the temperature as best a man could manage without proper instruments. It had not worked. The rinds had modeled wrong, the interiors had turned bitter, and when the buyers came from Helena 3 months prior, they had not bothered to hide their amusement. They were coming back in 3 weeks. Not with hope, he said this plainly, as if removing all sentiment was a kindness, but to finalize the terms of closure on any contract possibility, to make official what the smell of the room had already declared. He said all of this without quite looking at her. His eyes moved to the shelves, to the floor, to the high window, to the dark stain on the stone near the far wall. He did not apologize for the state of things. Apology would have required acknowledging that someone else's time had value, and he was not yet in the habit of that. When he finished, the room held its silence for a moment. She asked one question, and she asked it quietly, the way a woman asks something she already knows the answer to but needs confirmed by the person in front of her. What became of the milk already in the vats? He looked at her then, briefly, the way a man looks at someone who has just said something slightly bewildering in its simplicity. It had soured, he said. All of it. 3 days past turning. He'd been pouring it off and would finish the job this afternoon. There was no salvaging it. She said nothing, but her hand moved to her apron pocket, and her fingers closed around the brass tin. Not anxiously, not dramatically, but with the quiet deliberateness of a woman who has just understood the shape of the work ahead. The tin was small and warm from her body, and it held more than salt. It held a calculation she had not yet spoken aloud, because there was not yet anyone in this room who would know what it meant to hear it. She turned to the shelves and began to look at them the way a builder looks at a site. The first morning, she cleaned. That was all he saw, and so that was all he believed. She carried out the failures, the bloated, blackened rounds he had attempted in the early weeks of his experiment, the ones that had gone wrong in ways he could not name and did not understand. She stacked them outside the door without ceremony, without grimacing, without any of the small performances of disgust that might have made him feel worse than he already did. She simply removed them, the way a woman removes what no longer serves. She scrubbed the stone floor with lye and water, working on her knees with a methodical patience that suggested she had made peace with difficult work long before this particular room had ever entered her life. She aired the shelves. She opened the small high window that he had never thought to open, the one whose latch had stiffened from disuse, and she worked it free with the heel of her hand until the Montana air moved through the room the way it should, cool, and carrying the faint mineral smell of the hills. She set the pine boards back in their proper angles on the shelf uprights. She wiped them down with a cloth she had dampened and then half-dried so they were neither wet nor parched. He observed none of this closely. He had his own work to avoid thinking about. The daylight hours passed as daylight hours do on a failing ranch, filled with motion that produces little, with the particular exhaustion of a man maintaining something he is not certain is worth maintaining. He did not go back to the cheese room. She was there, and she was managing it, and that was enough for one day. What he did not see began at dusk. After the supper hour, after the light had gone low and gold and then gray, she returned to the room with a lamp and a clean pail, and the quiet of someone who has been waiting all day for this. The soured milk still sat in the second vat, not yet poured off, not yet lost. She had asked about it that morning for a reason, and the reason was this: sour milk, to most men, meant failure. To her grandmother, it had meant the beginning. She opened the brass tin. She worked by smell and by touch, the way the knowledge had been given to her, not written, not measured in any unit a merchant would recognize, but calibrated in the body, in the memory of standing beside an old woman in a stone-floored room, very much like this one, and learning to read what her hands were telling her. She adjusted the salt by fingertip. She tested the temperature against the inside of her wrist. She cut the curd in long, careful passes and watched how it fell apart, then how it held. She drained 4 portions through folded cloth, pressed them gently but firmly, shaped them, and set them on the pine boards. Each one she marked with a small notch cut by her thumbnail, a private sign, a quiet claim. No one saw her do it. The room held its secret, as stone rooms do. He was not a man who paid close attention to small things. That had always been his way. Broad strokes, large problems, the kind of trouble a man could see from a distance and ride toward with purpose. The quiet accumulations of daily life had a way of slipping past him unnoticed, the way creek water rises slowly, and then one morning the bank is simply gone. So it took him several days to understand what he was sensing. It began with the smell, or rather, the absence of it. He passed the cheese room each morning on his way to the second barn, and for 2 years that passage had carried with it a sourness that clung to the back of the throat, an odor that reminded him of everything he had attempted and ruined. He had learned to walk faster past that door. He had learned not to breathe too deeply. Then one morning he breathed and there was nothing. Not a scrubbed clean nothing, not the sharp edge of lye soap, but a quiet, cool neutrality, the smell of stone and pine and air moving as it should. He slowed without meaning to. He stood outside the door for a moment, one hand resting against the frame, and then moved on. He told himself she was simply thorough. Some people were. 2 days later he noticed the floor. He had opened the door on an errand, retrieving a wooden mallet he'd left leaning against the far wall, and he saw the stone, dry, pale gray, swept clean as a church step. It had never looked like that. Even in the room's best season, it had been damp and streaked. He stood there a moment, mallet in hand, and looked at the boards along the wall. Something was arranged there, he thought, cloth-wrapped, ordered. But he was not wearing his distance glasses, and he told himself, in a hurry. He was not in a hurry. He simply was not ready to look. The evening he could not explain away came without announcement, the way significant things often do. He had gone to the cheese room to measure the square footage of the south wall, a practical errand, something about ordering new shelving, and he stopped 3 steps into the room. She was at the pine boards with her back to him. Her hands were moving over a cloth-wrapped wheel in a way that was not cleaning. It was something older than cleaning. She was pressing the cloth in small, deliberate circles, working her palms along the curve of the thing with a sureness that had nothing to do with the $2 job she had been hired for. Her shoulders were set. Her head was tilted at the angle of a person listening. He did not speak. He stood in the doorway longer than a man with honest intentions would stand, watching those steady hands move in the lamplight, and then he stepped back into the cooling dark without a sound. He did not go inside that evening. He stood for a while in the yard, looking at nothing in particular, and something behind his eyes was quietly rearranging itself. He waited until morning. That was its own kind of restraint, the choice not to throw open the cheese room door in the dark and demand an accounting, but to sleep on it, or try to sleep on it, which is not the same thing at all. He lay in the narrow bed that had been his alone for years now, and he looked at the ceiling, and he thought about her hands. Not with sentiment, with something sharper than sentiment, a question that had been forming since the first day she arrived, and did not flinch at the smell of the ruined room. What, exactly, did this woman know, and why had she not said so? By the time the gray light came through the window, he had decided on directness. It was the only tool he had ever trusted. She was already in the cheese room when he crossed the yard. The door was open to the cool morning air, and she was at the shelves with her back to him, the same posture as the night before, the same unhurried steadiness. He stepped into the doorway and said her name, or rather, the way he said it functioned like a name, deliberate and separate from the air around it. She turned without surprise. She had known he would come. He kept his voice even. He asked what she was doing with his milk and his shelves without his instruction. He asked it plainly, without cruelty, but with the particular edge of a man who is used to being the sole author of what happens on his land, and who has just discovered a chapter he did not write. She did not look away. She did not explain herself in the fluttering way of someone caught at something wrong. She told him plainly she was making cheese, the way her grandmother made it, the old way, the careful way, the way that required salt and cloth and time and attention to smell and rind and patience, that most people no longer had. She told him this the way a person states geography, not as argument, not as apology, but as simple and unalterable fact. And then she said the thing that silenced him. If he wanted her to stop, she said, she would stop. She would put down the cloth and the tin and she would go back to scrubbing the floor for her $2. But the buyers were coming, she said, and when they came, they would find an empty room. She let that sentence stand without decoration. He was quiet for what felt, in that stone-floored room, like a very long time. He looked at the shelves. He counted the cloth-wrapped wheels without meaning to, 12 now, patient and pale in the morning light, each one pressed and sealed with the careful mark of her grandmother's method, each one smelling not of ruin but of something the room had never smelled of before. Something like potential. He did not tell her to stop. He did not say much of anything at all. He simply turned and walked back out into the yard, and the morning went on around him, and she went back to work. The days that followed were quiet in the way that only honest work can make a place quiet. Not empty, but settled, like a room where something important has been decided and does not need to be said again. He did not speak of what had passed between them in the cheese room. She did not invite him to. They moved around the ranch in their separate orbits, and if those orbits had shifted slightly, drawn a fraction closer without announcement, neither one made the mistake of naming it. But the lock on the cheese room door was different now. She noticed it on the second morning. She had arrived at the room before sunrise, as she always did, and found the latch unhooked, the door resting easy on its hinges. She stood at the threshold a moment before going in. She did not look back toward the house. She simply went in and began her work. The next morning it was the same, and the morning after. He had left the room unlocked each night, and she understood, the way a person understands weather, without needing it explained, that this was not carelessness. He was a man who latched things. She had seen him check the barn, the gate, the cellar door. He latched things because things had been taken from him before, and habit is longer than pain. For him to leave that door open was not forgetfulness. It was a choice he had made in the dark, alone, and said nothing about. She let it mean what it meant, and went on working. Then came the milk. The first morning she found the vessel at the doorstep, filled, fresh, already separated. She thought perhaps it was an accident of his routine. The second morning she thought less about it. The third morning, there was the cheesecloth, a new bolt of it, unrolled just enough to show its quality, left without ceremony on the low wooden step, as if it had always been there. She used all of it. The candle came on a Thursday evening. She had been working later than usual, reading the rinds in the dimming light, and when she stepped outside for a moment, she nearly walked into the small paper-wrapped tallow candle sitting on the step, like a quiet apology for something no one had done wrong. She carried it inside. She lit it. The cheese room held the flame without a draft, and the light was warm and steady, and she worked until the wheel in her hands was finished, and the salt on her palms had dried white as winter. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. This was the understanding they had built, not with words, which could be misread, and not with gesture, which could be mistaken, but with the plain grammar of provision and receipt. He gave what she needed to do the work. She did the work, and somewhere inside that simple exchange, something else was being made, as careful and as slow as what aged on the pine shelves behind her. It happened on a Friday morning, near the end of the second week. She had been at the shelves when he came in, not to inspect, she thought, but simply because the morning had drawn him that direction, the way a man will sometimes walk toward the thing he is most uncertain about. He stood in the doorway a moment with the pale light at his back, looking at the row of wrapped wheels, and then he looked at her. She had the brass tin in her hands. She had taken it down from the small ledge where she kept it, meaning to measure out the last of what was needed for the final wheel's rind. But something in the way he stood, not demanding, not suspicious, only quietly present, made her pause. She turned the tin once in her hands. Then she opened it. Not just the lid lifted and tilted away as she usually did, barely enough to reach inside. She opened it fully, the lid set aside, the tin held out at the level of her chest so he could see. He crossed the room slowly and looked down into it. The mixture was pale and dry, salt mostly, but threaded through with something darker, an herb ground fine enough to look like shadow in the granules. It did not look like much. It was the plainest thing in the room. She told him what it was. Salt from the stone, she said, dried herb from her grandmother's kitchen, the proportions never written down because her grandmother had held the belief that a recipe written on paper became a stranger's recipe, and she had wanted this one to remain her own. She told him what it did, drew the moisture, sealed the rind, kept the wrong things out, and let the right things breathe. He listened. Not with the half-attention of a man waiting for information to end. He listened the way a man listens when something is being said that he knows he will not hear again. His eyes stayed on the tin, and then on her hands, and then on her face, and he did not interrupt once. When she finished, he asked one question. "Where did your grandmother learn it?" She considered the question, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer deserved to be said without hurry. From necessity, she told him, and from love for the thing she was making. He looked at the tin a long moment after that. He did not speak, but he did not leave either. He stood in the warm, dim room with its smell of aged rind and pine board and salt, and the tin remained open between them like a page of something neither of them had yet finished reading. 2 days before the buyers were due to arrive, she asked him to come to the cheese room. She did not make a ceremony of it. She simply appeared at the door of the main house in the early afternoon, her hands clean and her expression composed, and said only that she thought he ought to see. He followed her across the yard without a word. The autumn light fell slant and pale across the grass, and the air held the particular stillness of a day that knows something is about to shift. She opened the cheese room door and stepped aside. He walked in. The room that had been, not 3 weeks before, a testament to failure, damp-smelling, clouded with the sour evidence of his miscalculation, was changed entirely. The pine shelves, which he had built with his own hands, and then stopped looking at, now held 14 wheels in a long and even row. Each one was wrapped in cloth gone slightly amber at the edges from the salt and herb rind. Each one sat firm and patient on the board, the way something sits when it has been made correctly and knows it. He walked the length of the shelf slowly. He did not touch any of them. She had not asked him not to, he simply did not. It was the instinct of a man who understands, in some wordless part of himself, that he is looking at something he did not make, and that touching it without permission would be a kind of presumption. When he reached the end of the shelf, he turned. She was watching him from the doorway, her arms at her sides, her expression holding none of the performance that a lesser person might have arranged for this moment. There was no satisfaction in it. There was only attention, the same quality of attention she had given the milk, the salt, the rind, the slow days of waiting. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who had been handed something fragile and heavy at the same time, and had not yet worked out how to carry it without dropping either quality. He told her she would be paid far more than $2. The words came out quietly. He meant them. She looked at the shelves once, briefly, and then back at him. What she wanted, she said, was not the kind of thing discussed with dollars. She did not say what it was. She let the words stand in the middle of the room between the two of them and the 14 golden wheels, solid and unhurried, like a rind that had been given exactly the time it needed to set. He did not ask her to explain. He understood that was not what this moment required of him. The buyers arrived on a Thursday, as they had promised, and they arrived with the particular confidence of men who expect to be confirmed in their previous opinion of a thing. They had their coats pressed. They had their ledger books. One of them had already prepared, somewhere in the back of his mind, the expression he intended to wear when he stepped through the cheese room door. The slow, practiced survey of a man who has seen failure before and knows the precise degree of sympathy that is appropriate without being costly. He met them at the gate and said nothing beyond the necessary words of greeting. He walked them across the yard without apology or preamble. The sun was high and flat, and the air carried the faint green smell of the valley in early afternoon. When he opened the cheese room door, the first thing that met them was not what they had expected. The smell was not ruin. It was deep and mineral and complex, the smell of something that had been given time and tending and the kind of patience that does not announce itself. She stood near the shelves, her hands folded, her expression as composed as the room itself. 14 wheels rested behind her on the pine boards, each one cloth-wrapped, each rind sealed in the herb-salt mixture that had come from a brass tin and a grandmother's memory and the slow discipline of 3 weeks of early mornings. The buyers stepped inside. They said nothing for a moment. He produced a knife and cut a clean wedge from the nearest wheel without asking permission or offering ceremony. He set it on the small table near the door. The buyers looked at it. Then one of them lifted it and tasted it. His expression changed. It changed the way weather changes on a mountain, not suddenly, but inevitably, as though the original condition had never been more than temporary. He passed the wedge to the other man. The second buyer tasted it. He set it down with the careful motion of someone who does not want to appear impressed, but has run out of the architecture required to conceal it. They named a price. It was a fair price. It was also not the right one. He named a higher one without blinking. The buyers exchanged the kind of glance that passes between men who have been outmaneuvered by someone they had not bothered to evaluate correctly. But before the pause could resolve into negotiation or retreat, he spoke again, and his voice carried the particular steadiness of a decision that had not been made in this moment, but some days before it, in a cheese room at dusk, in front of words left standing like a rind given exactly the time it needed to set. The maker of this cheese, he said, must be named in any contract drawn between us. The buyers looked at each other. He did not look away. They named her. It was not a complicated thing to write. 4 words added to a contract already thick with numbers and terms and the careful language of commerce. But the buyer's pen paused before it moved, and that pause said everything that would not be spoken aloud in that room. They were men who dealt in commodities, in weights and measures, in the reliable distances between supply and profit. They had not come expecting to write a woman's name into a wholesale agreement. They wrote it anyway. She stood near the window while it was done. She did not watch the pen move. She watched the light on the pine shelves instead, the way the afternoon fell across the cloth-wrapped wheels in long golden bars, the same light that had been there every morning when she came to turn them, every evening when she pressed a careful hand to each rind, to read what the hours had done. The room had been ruin when she entered it. It was something else now. The contract confirmed what the shelves already knew. Later, after the buyers had gone, and the sound of their wagon had thinned down the road into silence, he came back to the cheese room. She was still there. She had not left, because there was still work to do, and she was not a woman who left work unfinished. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way a man stands when he has rehearsed something and discovered, arriving at the moment, that the rehearsed version will not serve him. He asked her plainly. No performance in it, no flourish, just the question itself, set down like the brass tin on the table between them, small and honest and carrying more than it appeared to. Would she consider staying, not as a worker, as a partner, in the ranch, in the work, and in whatever came after that? She looked at the shelves. She looked at the tin. She looked at him. Then she named her terms. They were not unreasonable. They were, in fact, the terms of a woman who had spent enough years being paid $2 for work worth considerably more, and who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was finished with that arrangement. He agreed to every one of them. The deed was rewritten, both names on it, side by side, inked in the same hand, carrying equal weight on the page as they would carry equal weight on the land. The narrator, watching all of this from the comfortable distance of years, offers only this. She arrived with $2 worth of hope, and left with half of everything, which was, it turned out, exactly what she had always deserved.